Envision being assured of your indestructibility, your soul's unconquerable nature, only to find yourself stranded on a hellish island, starving, ill, and hunted by an enemy with endless ammunition and a solution for every problem. This was the nightmare that shattered Japan's elite soldiers at Guadalcanal. For half a decade, the Imperial Japanese Army's troops had known nothing but triumph, from China's fields to Malaya's jungles. They had effortlessly brushed aside every foe, convinced that their Yamato Damashi, their indomitable spirit, rendered them impervious. This was no mere propaganda, it was a deeply rooted conviction, validated across numerous battlegrounds. Yet when the Japanese forces were dispatched to the remote and desolate Guadalcanal island in the Solomon Archipelago, anticipating a swift triumph, they had been led to believe that the American adversaries they would encounter were soft, indulged by comfortable lives, and would undoubtedly crumble and retreat at the first taste of genuine combat. However, they were not merely facing Americans, they were confronting the United States Marines. These were no longer the peacetime soldiers of the past, but rather young men forged in the hardships of the Great Depression. Individuals who understood the meaning of deprivation, toiling until their hands bled for a single dollar. They had enlisted after the Pearl Harbor attack, driven by a resolute determination. And now, they were poised to confront the invading forces. In the stifling wilderness, a pivotal confrontation was about to unfold, one that would challenge the world's perceptions of American fortitude. The seasoned Japanese soldiers, veterans of countless battles, had long considered the jungle their domain, believing the darkness to be their greatest ally. Yet on the shores of Guadalcanal, they would soon discover that the jungle had chosen a new master, and the very shadows they had once embraced would betray them in the most harrowing manner imaginable. Every tenet of their military doctrine, every assumption of their own superiority, was about to be systematically dismantled by a new breed of American fighting force. One fueled by gasoline, gunpowder, and an unbreakable will to triumph. This monumental clash of ideologies and armies had begun just 2 weeks earlier. On August 7, 1942, a contingent of 11,000 Marines from the 1st Marine Division, under the command of General Alexander Vandegrift, stormed the shores of Lunga Point. This marked the commencement of Operation Watchtower, the United States' inaugural major offensive of the war, a bold and risky endeavor to seize a partially constructed Japanese airfield. The objective, at least on paper, was straightforward: capture the airfield, establish a defensive perimeter, and maintain control. However, the planners in Washington could scarcely have foreseen the sheer ferocity of the 6-month struggle that was about to unfold. Guadalcanal was more than just an island, it was a vision of hell on earth, spanning 90 miles in length and 25 miles in width. The terrain where the impending conflict would unfold was a daunting amalgamation of formidable obstacles. Towering 8,000-foot mountains, perpetually shrouded in mist, formed an imposing fortress around the coastal plain. This plain itself was a nightmarish landscape, dominated by razor-sharp Kenai grass, suffocating swamps, and dense triple-canopy jungles where visibility was severely limited. The oppressive heat was a constant adversary, a heavy, humid blanket that never relented, making every breath a laborious task. And then there were the swarms of mosquitoes, emerging from the marshes in dense, black clouds, so numerous that soldiers would inadvertently inhale them. These insects carried the deadly malaria, a foe even more relentless than the tropical waterways appeared serene, yet concealed a host of parasitic threats that would incapacitate countless individuals through dysentery and other maladies. Remarkably, the initial landing proved almost anticlimactic, as the 2,800 Japanese construction workers and naval personnel, completely unprepared, swiftly vanished into the dense foliage. They abandoned everything in their wake: tools, vehicles, provisions, and most crucially, the nearly completed airstrip. By the following day, American engineers had already commenced operations, christening the facility Henderson Field in tribute to a fallen Marine pilot from the Battle of Midway. Within a matter of days, the first U.S. aircraft touched down, marking the birth of the renowned Cactus Air Force. The renowned American icon, whose legacy endures, entered the world. If you deem these narratives of American fortitude and innovation as vital as we do, a straightforward click of the like button conveys that you wish to hear these historical accounts. This simple gesture greatly assists us in sharing these remarkable stories with a wider audience. However, the Japanese were a formidable adversary, not to be underestimated. Their retaliation emerged from the ocean, and it was catastrophic. On the fateful night of August 9, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa commanded a fleet of cruisers and a destroyer, launching a daring raid in the now famous Battle of Savo Island. The United States Navy experienced its most devastating defeat in history during this engagement. The Allied naval forces suffered a devastating blow in a brutal, close-range naval engagement that lasted just under an hour. 4 of their heavy cruisers were sunk, taking over 1,000 sailors to their watery graves. This catastrophic loss had immediate and alarming consequences. Fearing further casualties, the remaining Allied naval units retreated, withdrawing the transports that still carried the Marines' vital supplies, equipment, and heavy armaments. Suddenly, the 11,000 Marines on Guadalcanal found themselves utterly isolated on a hostile island, facing a determined enemy poised to annihilate them. With only half their food and a fraction of their ammunition, the Marines were in a desperate situation. It was in this moment of crisis that the true nature of their struggle came into sharp focus. The Guadalcanal campaign was a pivotal moment in the Pacific theater. The Japanese High Command, intoxicated by their naval triumph at Savo, failed to grasp a critical, game-altering fact. Henderson Field had become the epicenter of the conflict. As long as American aircraft could take to the skies from that dirt runway, they commanded the surrounding seas for hundreds of miles during daylight hours. This meant that while the Japanese could dominate the night, using their swift destroyers for what the Marines grimly referred to as the Tokyo Express, to deliver troops and supplies, the daylight belonged to the Cactus Air Force. Any Japanese vessel caught in those waters after sunrise was essentially a sitting duck. This singular reality compelled Japan to act. The airfield had to be reclaimed swiftly before the Americans could fortify the island into an impregnable aerial base. This critical task was entrusted to Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake and his 17th Army. However, his forces were scattered across the vast Pacific. The closest available unit was the 28th Infantry Regiment, led by Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, a respected tactician and instructor, yet also known for his impulsiveness and unwavering faith in the Japanese fighting spirit. Informed by reports of American soldiers, Ichiki departed for Guadalcanal with a conviction in their weakness. The Japanese commander, Ichiki, was determined to act swiftly, convinced that the reports of only 2,000 American troops on the island were accurate. Believing his elite, battle-hardened forces could easily overwhelm them in a single night, Ichiki disregarded orders to wait for the rest of his regiment. On the evening of August 18, 6 Japanese destroyers silently approached the shore, landing 917 of Ichiki's men at Tevu Point, about 15 miles east of the American perimeter. The landing was executed flawlessly and went completely undetected. Ichiki immediately dispatched patrols to scout the American lines, a standard procedure that would. The following day, a Marine patrol led by Captain Charles Brush encountered a Japanese unit, resulting in a fierce firefight. The Marines, armed with their semi-automatic M1 Garand rifles, overpowered the Japanese, killing 31 of them. Crucially, the Marines seized documents, maps, and orders that exposed Ichiki's plan and the Japanese military's mistaken belief that they faced only a small American force. Captain Brush immediately relayed this information to General Vandegrift, who now understood that a major Japanese assault was imminent, and it would come from an unexpected direction. The Marines swiftly fortified their positions along the Ilu River's mouth, which they had mistakenly labeled the Tenaru on their maps. Colonel Clifton Cates entrusted the defense of this sector to Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. Cresswell, a meticulous and no-nonsense officer, established the defenses with deadly precision. He strategically positioned machine gun nests to create interlocking fields of fire, covering every inch of the sandbar at the river's mouth. His men dug in, laid barbed wire, and sighted their mortars, preparing a formidable welcome party. What followed was one of the most one-sided. Colonel Ichiki, a confident and impatient commander, disregarded his orders to await reinforcements. That fateful night, he led a frontal assault across the sandbar, convinced that the Japanese warrior spirit could overcome any material shortcomings. Ichiki believed his men's fierce "Banzai" cries would shatter the Americans' morale and breach their lines with bayonets and grenades. However, he had underestimated his adversaries. The resilience of the Marine Corps or the sheer numerical advantage of American military might. Shortly after midnight, a local guide named Jacob Vuza, who had been captured and brutally tortured by the Japanese for hours, managed to escape despite sustaining a dozen bayonet wounds. Staggering into the Marine lines, he gasped out a warning. "They're coming." Moments later, the jungle exploded into chaos. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers burst from the tree line, rushing across the open sandbar. Their battle cries, intended to instill terror in their foes, echoed through the night. Yet the Marines stood firm, holding their fire as they had been trained to do. Then Cresswell gave the order. The venerable M1917 Browning machine guns unleashed a torrent of fire. These were aging water-cooled weapons dating back to the Great War, yet their lethality remained undiminished. Each gun spewed forth 600 rounds per minute in an unrelenting barrage. The interlocking fields of fire functioned precisely as intended, creating a scythe of lead that swept across the sandbar. Japanese soldiers fell in droves, the initial wave annihilated before reaching the midpoint. The second wave charged over the bodies of their fallen comrades, only to meet the same grim fate. Those few who managed to stagger through the hail of machine gun fire then confronted the 37mm anti-tank guns, whose canister rounds functioned as giant shotgun blasts. The ferocious assault unleashed a devastating barrage, pummeling the advancing enemy formations. For hours, the Japanese forces continued their relentless, self-destructive charges. Fierce hand-to-hand combat erupted as some managed to reach the Marine foxholes, with knives, bayonets, and fists clashing in savage confrontations. Yet the Marine line held firm. As dawn broke, the scale of the Japanese catastrophe became evident. Over 800 of their men lay dead or dying on the sandbar, with the waterway the Marines had dubbed Alligator Creek choked with their fallen comrades. However, the ordeal was far from over for the survivors. As daylight spread across the battlefield, General Vandegrift ordered a counterattack. 5 M3 Stuart light tanks then rumbled across the sandbar. The tanks advanced cautiously through the coconut plantation, where the surviving Japanese soldiers had sought refuge. War correspondent Richard Tregaskis observed the chilling efficiency of the armored vehicles as they systematically flushed out the hidden enemy troops, their machine guns and canister shells unleashing sheets of yellow flame. By midday, the battle had concluded. Of the 917 soldiers in Ichiki's detachment, only around 128 support troops who had been held in reserve managed to retreat into the jungle, while the colonel himself was among the casualties. The official Japanese account claims Ichiki took his own life in a ritual suicide, consumed by shame. The Marines' resolute stand on the battlefield left a profound psychological impact on the Japanese forces. Contrary to their expectations, the American troops had not panicked or retreated, but instead leveraged the terrain and their firepower with a ruthless efficiency that shattered the Japanese's long-held beliefs. When the survivors and strategists in Rabaul examined the aftermath, they were confronted with a stark realization. The Americans possessed a material advantage that was simply staggering. The Browning machine guns had not faltered, and the battle for Bloody Ridge had demonstrated the American military's formidable capabilities. The Marines' ammunition reserves were seemingly boundless, ensuring a steady stream of firepower. 1540 This was not a clash of morale, but rather a battle between human spirit and an industrialized killing machine. 1548 and the machine had emerged victorious. This catastrophic defeat should have served as a wake-up call for the Japanese High Command, 1555 signaling the need for a massive, coordinated effort with overwhelming force to reclaim Guadalcanal. 1600, however, they were slow to heed this lesson. 1605, they still believed the Tenaru defeat was an anomaly, a consequence of Ichiki's recklessness. 1612, rather than a fundamental flaw in their own military doctrine. Consequently, they decided to dispatch additional troops, this time 1620 under the command of a more cautious commander. Kiyotake Kawaguchi oversaw the operations. Between the final days of August and early September, the Tokyo Express was a hive of activity, ferrying nearly 5,000 troops from Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade to the island. The swift destroyers successfully evaded the American planes from Henderson Field. However, this reinforcement method had a critical flaw. The destroyers could transport personnel but lacked the capacity for heavy equipment, tanks, heavy artillery, and, most crucially, adequate food and medical supplies. The soldiers arrived on Guadalcanal with only their personal gear, immediately facing shortages and forced to scavenge for sustenance in the unforgiving jungle. The Japanese forces on the island faced a dire logistical predicament, as their supply lines proved woefully inadequate, ultimately dooming their every effort. While the Marines enjoyed a steady flow of provisions delivered by sea, the Japanese soldiers gradually succumbed to starvation. It was a war of attrition, with one side benefiting from a robust supply chain connected to America's industrial heartland, while the other relied on a trickle of men and rice ferried by destroyers under the cover of darkness. In contrast to the impulsive Ichiki, General Kawaguchi adopted a more methodical approach. He spent weeks meticulously assembling his forces and devising his attack plan, scheduled for September 12. Kawaguchi's strategy was far more sophisticated, involving a three-pronged assault. Kawaguchi's strategy aimed to create a distraction along the coastline, while the bulk of his forces marched through the dense inland jungle to assault what his intelligence suggested was the weakest point of the American perimeter, a lengthy grassy ridge south of Henderson Field. This ridge, he believed, held the key to breaching the American defenses. It was a well-conceived plan based on solid intelligence. However, Kawaguchi was unaware that the Marines had intelligence of their own. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, Red Mike, Edson, commander of the elite 1st Raider Battalion, had recently led a raid on a Japanese supply base, where his men uncovered documents and supplies. The Marine Corps icon, Edson, swiftly recognized the peril and potential in the situation. Requesting permission from General Vandegrift, he promptly led his 840 raiders and paramarines to occupy the strategic ridge on September 10. For the next 2 days, they fortified their position, mirroring the defensive preparations of Cresswell's men at the Tenaru. Clearing fields of fire, deploying machine guns for overlapping coverage, and sighting their mortars on all probable approach routes, they braced for the impending onslaught. Ominous troop movements and supply dumps clearly signaled that a major assault was imminent, with the main thrust expected from the south, directly targeting the ridge. Recognizing the gravity of the threat and the opportunity it presented, the legendary Edson acted decisively. He sought and obtained Vandegrift's approval to move his battalion onto the ridge, intent on establishing a robust defensive posture. The 11th Marines Artillery Unit had already plotted their targets, anticipating the imminent Japanese assault. They were transforming the 1,000-yard Coral Ridge, with its 3 distinct knobs and tall kanai grass offering minimal cover, into a deadly trap. Flanking the ridge were deep, jungle-filled ravines, ideal for an infiltrating force to utilize under the cover of darkness, a location that would soon become known as Bloody Ridge. On the night of September 12, Kawaguchi's troops, using the jungle ravines for concealment, commenced their probing attacks, searching for vulnerabilities in the Marine defenses. The ensuing combat was disoriented and frantic from the outset. Japanese troops would abruptly emerge from the gloom, lobbing grenades and charging with fixed bayonets. The Marines retaliated with everything at their disposal, but Edson's defensive measures proved effective whenever the Japanese massed for a major assault. The Marine mortars and artillery rained down upon them, shattering their formations. The 11th Marines unleashed over 2,000 projectiles that evening, erecting a curtain of high explosives that the Japanese could not breach. The combat on the ridge was among the most ferocious of the entire conflict. That night, Sergeant John Basilone became a revered figure, as he operated a machine gun section, fending off wave after wave of. The enemy assault had been halted, but the threat remained. Kawaguchi's forces still had fresh troops at the ready. Recognizing the likelihood of a renewed attack, Edson prudently withdrew his depleted lines, consolidating his defenses on the final hill of the ridge, closest to Henderson Field. Vandegrift promptly dispatched reinforcements to bolster Edson's position. As the sun rose, it was clear that the courageous Marine's extraordinary actions had earned him the prestigious Medal of Honor, a testament to his unwavering valor in the face of overwhelming adversity. Yet the battle was far from over, as Kawaguchi's men prepared to renew their assault. As the sun dipped below the horizon on September 13, the Marines braced themselves for the next phase of the battle. At 10:07 p.m., the fighting intensified, with Kawaguchi desperately seeking a breakthrough. His troops charged forward with a suicidal bravery that stunned the American forces. Some of the attacks came dangerously close to Edson's command post. In the most critical moment, Edson himself stood on a crate, exposed to enemy fire, rallying his men and urging them to hold their ground. "Marines live forever," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos of the battlefield, and they held their position once again. The combination of determined defense and precisely coordinated firepower proved to be the decisive factor. The Japanese assault on Bloody Ridge was a resounding failure. By the morning of September 14, Kawaguchi's offensive had collapsed, with over 800 Japanese soldiers lying dead on the grassy slopes. While the Marines had suffered heavy casualties, with more than 100 killed and 200 wounded, they had successfully defended the key to the entire island. For the surviving Japanese, the shock was even greater than at the Tenaru. Despite their use of sophisticated infiltration tactics and incredible bravery, they had been systematically destroyed. The diaries they left behind all conveyed the same message: they had expected to fight men, but instead had encountered a formidable military machine. The Guadalcanal campaign witnessed a relentless clash of military might, with the Japanese forces employing a formidable arsenal of artillery, mortars, and machine guns. The battles of the Tenaru and Bloody Ridge set the tone for the rest of the conflict, as the Japanese launched courageous but ultimately futile attacks, only to be ground down by the superior firepower and logistics of the American forces. However, the horrors of Guadalcanal extended beyond the battlefield, with the environment itself proving to be a merciless adversary. By December, over 8,000 Marines in the 1st Division had succumbed to the ravages of malaria, while dysentery and jungle rot further ravaged the troops on both sides. The American troops on Guadalcanal faced a harrowing ordeal, with their skin peeling off in sheets due to severe fungal infections. However, the situation for the Japanese was even more dire. Their supply lines had been disrupted, leading to a slow and agonizing starvation. Rations were slashed repeatedly, until a single rice ball had to sustain a soldier for an entire day. Medical supplies were scarce, and wounded men succumbed to simple infections. By late October, over 60% of the Japanese forces were deemed unfit for combat due to malnutrition and illness. The island had earned a grim new moniker among the Japanese soldiers: Starvation Island. This widening logistical disparity was the hidden factor that would ultimately decide the fate of the battle. The American forces enjoyed a distinct advantage in their supply chain during the Guadalcanal campaign. While the Japanese troops resorted to consuming grass and tree bark to stave off starvation, the American supply ships arrived regularly, safeguarded by the aircraft from Henderson Field. The Marines had access to canned rations, received letters from their loved ones, and were treated at field hospitals with the aid of skilled surgeons and life-saving plasma. An American machine gunner could continue firing until the barrel melted, only to be promptly replaced, in stark contrast to the Japanese machine gunners who were instructed to ration their ammunition for the most critical situations. This disparity in logistical support formed the bedrock upon which the American triumph was built, demonstrating that in the modern era of warfare, logistics were not merely a component of the strategy, but the very foundation upon which victory was secured. The Japanese staged their most substantial and conclusive offensive to reclaim the island in late October. General Hyakutake himself arrived to spearhead the operation, bolstering his forces with elite troops from the 2nd Division. The plan entailed another intricate, multi-pronged assault, with the primary thrust once again originating from the jungle in the south. The offensive commenced on October 23, led by a rare and valuable force of 9 Japanese tanks. However, the Americans were prepared, utilizing anti-tank guns and their own Stuart light tanks to swiftly destroy all 9 enemy armored vehicles. This attack proved a costly failure. The main event unfolded the following night, as nearly 6,000. The Imperial Japanese forces collided with the American defensive line approximately 26 miles and 58 kilometers south of the airfield, a sector held by the 1st Battalion of the 7th Marine Regiment, commanded by the now legendary Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller. The battle that ensued that night became a legendary chapter in Marine Corps history. The Japanese launched relentless assaults, and the fighting was at close quarters, often devolving into brutal hand-to-hand combat. Once again, Sergeant John Basilone proved instrumental in turning the tide. He appeared to be ubiquitous, operating machine guns, clearing weapon malfunctions under enemy fire, and leading counterattacks to plug gaps in the defensive line. By dawn, the Japanese assault had been decisively repelled. Over 2,000 of their finest soldiers lay dead in front of the Marine positions. The American forces on Guadalcanal endured significant losses, but they managed to hold their ground. Henderson Field remained firmly under their control, marking a critical juncture in the Japanese campaign on the island. Simultaneously, a series of intense naval engagements unfolded in the surrounding waters, ultimately sealing Japan's fate in the decisive naval battle of Guadalcanal in mid-November. Despite sustaining heavy casualties, the U.S. Navy successfully repelled a Japanese force that included 2 battleships, preventing them from bombarding the vital Henderson Field. In a dramatic night action, the USS Washington, leveraging its superior radar capabilities, located and sank the enemy vessels. The Japanese naval vessel Kirishima was vanquished in a pivotal maritime engagement. This triumph at sea proved decisive, as it effectively precluded Japan from deploying substantial reinforcements or heavy materiel. A final convoy of 11 transport ships was nearly annihilated by American aerial and naval forces, with only a fraction of its personnel and none of its heavy supplies reaching the shore. For the Japanese soldiers already entrenched on the island, this was the ultimate setback. They had been clinging to survival with the expectation that reinforcements would arrive. Now that glimmer of hope had been extinguished, as evidenced by the harrowing accounts documented in the diaries of these Japanese combatants, a somber chronicle of their gradual, agonizing demise. The Japanese forces on Guadalcanal endured a harrowing ordeal, with many succumbing to starvation and despair. Eyewitness accounts describe soldiers resorting to consuming leaves, roots, and even the remains of their fallen comrades, as once proud troops wasted away into living skeletons. By December 1942, the Japanese High Command in Tokyo made the difficult decision to evacuate the island, acknowledging Guadalcanal as a lost cause. The evacuation, codenamed Operation K, was a remarkable feat of deception and naval prowess. Over 3 nights in early February 1943, Japanese destroyers stealthily slipped in and rescued nearly 11,000 starving survivors. While a tactical success, the scale of the disaster could not be hidden. Of the 36,000 Japanese soldiers sent to Guadalcanal, nearly 25,000 had perished. The Guadalcanal campaign marked a pivotal juncture in the Pacific theater, shattering the myth of Japanese military supremacy. Approximately 15,000 combatants perished, with an additional 10,000 succumbing to disease and starvation. This decisive engagement irrevocably shifted the strategic initiative into American hands. Beyond a mere military triumph, Guadalcanal represented a psychological turning point, proving that the American soldier, when properly equipped, trained, and led, could match and even surpass the vaunted Japanese warrior. Surviving Japanese officers acknowledged several hard-learned lessons from the campaign, having grossly underestimated the American will to fight and failing to comprehend the sheer scale of American industrial and logistical capabilities. The Guadalcanal campaign taught the Americans a harsh lesson, that individual bravery and determination, no matter how formidable, could not withstand the systematic, overwhelming application of modern firepower. As one veteran later observed, the war was ultimately decided by the strength of each side's systems. America's comprehensive infrastructure for supply, medical care, artillery, and air support proved far superior to Japan's outdated and failing frameworks. The Americans also gained a profound respect for their Japanese adversaries, recognizing them as tenacious, fanatical fighters who would battle to the bitter end. Additionally, they were forced to confront the brutal realities of jungle warfare. The tactics they honed would propel them across the vast Pacific, all the way to the Japanese homeland. But the most crucial takeaway was a renewed sense of self-assurance. They had faced the Japanese Empire's finest in some of the harshest imaginable conditions, and emerged victorious. Looking back at Guadalcanal, the Japanese terror wasn't rooted in fear of the individual American soldier. It stemmed from a dawning, chilling realization that they were up against an adversary whose factories could outproduce them tenfold in a mere month, an enemy whose resources appeared inexhaustible. The artillery of the opposing forces never ceased their bombardment, and the American aircraft dominated the skies. The Japanese soldiers faced the dread realization that for every one of their comrades who fell, 10 more American troops were ready to take their place. Gradually, they came to the chilling understanding that their courage, sacrifice, and warrior spirit were ultimately meaningless against the relentless, unstoppable tide of American industrial power. The jungles of Guadalcanal had consumed an entire army, shattering the myth of an invincible Japanese empire. The lessons learned there, in a crucible of blood, mud, and starvation, would resonate through every subsequent battle, all the way to the shores of Tokyo Bay. The story of what transpired on that island was more than just a military engagement. The naval engagements that unfolded during this pivotal campaign were instrumental in shaping the outcome. A testament to the unwavering resolve of the American people, these battles exemplified their refusal to succumb. To delve further into the captivating narratives of these naval encounters, we invite you to explore the dedicated video presentation available on your screen. Simply click the link to continue the captivating journey through this vital chapter of our nation's history. We appreciate your time and dedication in preserving the memory of these momentous events.